I mean, I think so. If I think of a controversial, it's a mining program, but it's not environmental. It's the Pebble Mine that sits on the very edge of the single most plentiful salmon run up in Alaska, right? They
Mm-hmm.
want to put a mine which is going to have basically a giant pool of poisonous water sitting on the topsoil where it rains all the time, where there's earthquakes all the time. It's going to be held back by levees. Oh, yeah, and every once in a while things flood. Like, there's just no way it's not going to do it, but some people are just pro work, you know, uh, pro mine,
Yeah.
for all the benefits that mines do, and mines do bring benefits. And then other people are just losing their minds because they're like, this is the one place you should not do this, right?
Right. There's some kind of weird calculus that goes on in people's brain where they think, yeah, we know it's bad, but it's going to generate this much money, and so it's worth it. And the other group of people say, that's ridiculous. It's not worth it. Or it's going to produce so many more costs in the future having to deal with the cleanup.
Well, that's weird, right? Because you get into the macroeconomic distribution of your values, right?
Yeah, and I got to be honest with you, most of the time, couldn't care less about the stupid economics. So in terms of
wow, listen, man, sounds like somebody who's not poor. No, I mean, I can see why economics can be important. I just don't think it's important at all costs.
Yeah.
Right? Like the economics of things, and there are certain risks that seem more reasonable than other ones. This one doesn't seem reasonable to me.
Yeah, and there are some damages that can't be fixed.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Just don't do it, you know.
And there's certain species and things that are more fragile than others. Like salmon are a very unique species in that sense that they have one river. Like from river to river, the species of salmon vary. Like it's very particular.
Mm-hmm.
There's sometimes salmon jet off and go up a different river than they were born in, but for the most part, they stick to the same river. So you destroy that river, you've just wiped out an entire population.
Yeah, a significant chunk of the genetic diversity of the species. Yeah, and obviously being from the Pacific Northwest, salmon were always around. That was always something that I was aware of and heard about. But it's a great example of some of those salmon runs are really healthy and fine, and some of them are at risk. But everyone's used to seeing them up there. Fishing salmon is a very common activity. People don't necessarily understand the dynamics of those populations up there. And all they've got to depend on is a scientist telling them, hey, look, we need to protect this. And their experience is, I don't know.
So what do you think? Do you think that is a problem with a lot of, well, maybe, I don't know if it is a problem or not. I just have to ask the question. Is it a problem that scientists and biologists and people who raise these concerns, and maybe you could argue environmentalists, don't always articulate the consequences or how, what do I want to say? They don't communicate the dynamic aspect of it very well, and that's why there can continue to be controversy? Or is it that just the audience doesn't want to hear it? Or, I mean, how do you read that scenario?
Well, I mean, you've heard me trying to explain some of these concepts like trophic cascades. It's hard.
Okay.
So that plays a role for sure. But this is starting to diverge into politics. And I will say it briefly. I will say it very briefly. There does seem to be a weird backlash against scientists.
Yeah, that is something
Generally.
that is experts. I think there's a lot of American institutions that right now people are questioning for a multitude of reasons. Notwithstanding some of those reasons being very legitimate, right?
Well,
some of them not so much, but some of them, and then some of them, some of the reasons being questioned go way off into very strange things like Pizzagate, which is just like, whoa. You're like, that's just the internet got you, man.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a little bit of a backlash, and it is unfortunate because if you and the sad part is people are not as scientifically literate as maybe they could benefit from being, because it would benefit us all to understand how things work better. I feel the same way about history and politics, right? Like, many people have opinions about politics, but many of them also don't necessarily know exactly how the system's supposed to work or has worked in the past. And so gut feelings and intuitions take over and fill in the gaps. I think the same is true about science in a lot of ways, right?
And I find it to be a real shame in that, I can't be an expert on everything. I
Yeah.
really can't. So I have to be able to depend on other people to give me their honest opinions about the way they see things. I think the problem is that there are a lot of people that have ulterior motives, and we're starting to recognize that. But it's like the baby's being thrown out with the bathwater in this case, because there's some dishonest people now. Every scientist who says your best protection for us as a society to deal with COVID is to wear masks. Because someone said that, it becomes called and well, they're just trying to control us, or maybe they're with the mask lobby. We're so suspicious of everything.
Well, in fairness, that one flip-flopped a little bit, because there was like, masks don't matter in the beginning when they were trying to preserve them, and then all of a sudden everybody should be wearing a mask.
Mm-hmm.
It's again messaging, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if they would have came out and said, guys, if you can make masks at home, go for it. That's great. Any covering, it's not perfect, but it will help. Like, I felt like there was a level of inconsistency there that was self-harming. You know what I'm saying? In the message,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate, and people are upset, and I understand why they're upset, because nobody likes to be lied to. Nobody likes to be treated like let me rephrase. Nobody likes to be treated like they can't make a decision. In the same scenario, lots of people have been making really bad decisions. So I don't know what the answer is there.
Well, keep in mind,
there's
not science. I mean, there's science, of course, but it was a new disease, so people had to understand its dynamics. So the specialists, they took their best stab, tried to understand, and made their best estimates about how to handle it. And they could be wrong. But in terms of the sciences, like talking about the Pebble Mine or talking about salmon, when people study these systems for decades, and they do a scientific study, they go out and they gather data, they've got a methodology that they've done, they did the work, they compiled it, they synthesized it, and they wrote a paper. They submitted it to a journal. The journal took it and they said, this scientist over here, that other guy, and this one both know this field really well. They have them read it. Those guys all read it and they say, yeah, it looks like they did a good job, but they need to do this. So it goes through this whole process and then it's published. Bang. That is how scientific knowledge is generated. It's not a person. It's not a personality who did a YouTube video that people can watch and buy into it or not. It's a consensus from the scientific community. That carries a great deal of gravitas, and it's frustrating to me that people question it. Obviously, there are people with ulterior motives. Someone might do a study on a drug, and they might mess up the data to make somebody happy. I agree that can happen.
There's some very famous examples, right?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
That go both. I mean, let's go both directions with this. There's manipulative ways in which certain drug companies have tested their products against, like, placebo instead of testing it against a cheaper competitive drug, right? To make it seem like, oh, this is this much better than placebo, when realistically it's not really that much better than, say, another drug that does the same thing. That's an example of how people are doing it to make money, right? That's the ulterior motives.
Sure.
But then you also have people like, the most famous guy who did the whole study that, quote unquote, figured out that vaccines caused autism, which was totally debunked and has repeatedly been attempted to be repeated, and it's no truth to it, and yet people still quote it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say, like, scientific literacy and understanding, just even you talking about that, is it would be great that people had enough knowledge or came out of, high school or college versed enough to be able to, like, we almost all need a new and improved bullshit filter,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, you need to have the ability to go, I'm not an expert on this, but I know enough to tell if this person is fibbing a little bit.
Sure.
Because it's never the person who's out and out telling a straight lie who gets you. It's the person who tells a half lie.
Mm-hmm.
It's the guy who caught a fish, but he says it's a couple inches bigger than it actually was. It's not the guy who tells you that they caught a shark. So I agree. There's a backlash. I understand why there's a backlash. I'm also hoping that we get to a place where people are able to fact check things better, and be aware of things more, especially when there are, like we're talking about with, extreme and certain environmental things. Like, there can be real long-standing consequences. There has been environmental disasters in the US that last 50 to 100 years, especially, when we're talking about, poisoning groundwater and,